Emma Wilson stood in the doorway of her small farmhouse, holding the bank notice with shaking hands. The morning sun felt cold against her face as she read the words again. Final notice, foreclosure. In 30 days. Her green eyes filled with tears as the paper trembled in her grip. Her father had been sick for 2 years now. The medical bills kept coming like a never-ending storm, and the farm barely made enough money to survive. Emma worked from sunrise to sunset, feeding the animals, tending the crops, and caring for her father. But no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. The small farmhouse had been in her family for 3 generations. Her grandfather had built it with his own hands. And her father had raised her there after her mother died when Emma was just 10 years old. Now, at 22, Emma faced losing the only home she had ever known. She looked out at the rolling fields that stretched toward the mountains. The corn was growing well this season, but it would not be ready to harvest for another month. Even then, the money would not be enough to pay what they owed the bank. A cloud of dust appeared on the dusty road leading to their farm. Emma squinted in the bright sunlight and saw a horse and rider approaching. The rider was tall and wore a dark hat pulled low over his eyes. Emma's heart sank like a stone in deep water. She knew why he was here. The man climbed down from his horse slowly, as if his bones were tired. He looked like someone who had done this job too many times before. His boots were worn and dusty, and his clothes were simple but clean. His name was Thomas Reed, and he worked for the bank collecting debts from people who could not pay. Emma wiped her tears quickly and stepped onto the front porch. She would not let this stranger see her cry. Her father, William, sat in his wheelchair nearby, watching with worried eyes. Miss Wilson, the man's voice was quiet and respectful, not harsh like Emma had expected. I'm here about the money you owe. Emma lifted her chin, trying to be brave like her father had taught her. I know why you're here, sir, but I need more time. My father is very sick, and I'm doing everything I can. Thomas looked round the small farm with careful eyes. He saw the broken fence that Emma had tried to fix with old wood and rusty nails. He saw the old barn that needed new paint and repairs. He noticed the wheelchair on the front porch where Emma's father sat watching them with dignity despite his illness. Something in Thomas's chest felt heavy, like a weight he had never carried before. How much time do you need? He asked softly, his voice gentler than any debt collector Emma had ever imagined. Emma was surprised by his kindness. Most debt collectors were mean and cold, caring only about getting money. But this man seemed different. His eyes were kind. Even though his job was hard, there was something in his face that reminded Emma of her father when he looked at injured animals. I don't know, she whispered, fresh tears starting to fall despite her efforts to be strong. Maybe forever. Thomas stood there for a long moment, his hat in his hands. He looked at this brave young woman who was fighting so hard for her family. Her dress was old but clean, and her hands showed the calluses of hard work. She reminded him of a wildflower growing in rocky soil, beautiful and strong despite the difficult conditions. He had collected debts from hundreds of people in towns across the state, but he had never felt like this before. Usually, he did his job quickly and moved on to the next town. But something about Emma Wilson and her sick father made him want to stay and help instead of hurt. I'll be staying at the inn in town tonight, Thomas said finally. I'll come back tomorrow, and we can talk more about your situation. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. She watched as Thomas climbed back onto his horse and rode away toward town, dust trailing behind him like a golden cloud. That night, Thomas sat in his small room at the inn, staring out the window toward the Wilson farm. He could not stop thinking about Emma and her sick father. He had money saved from years of working. Money he had never spent because he had nowhere to call home and no family to care for. Thomas had grown up in an orphanage. Moving from one foster family to another, he had learned to be alone, to not get attached to people or places. His job collecting debts suited him because it meant he never stayed anywhere long enough to care. But now, for the first time in his 30 years of life, Thomas Reed had found something worth fighting for. He thought about Emma's brave face, and her father's quiet dignity. He thought about the little farm that meant everything to them and nothing to the bank dot as the stars appeared in the dark sky. Thomas made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. The next morning, Thomas returned to the Wilson farm just as the sun was climbing over the distant hills. The air was fresh and cool, filled with the sounds of birds singing and chickens clucking in the yard. Emma was feeding her chickens, scattering corn from a wooden bucket. Her dress was simple but clean, patched in a few places but worn with dignity. She looked up when she heard the sound of horse hooves on the dirt road. Fear flashed in her green eyes like lightning in a storm. She had spent the whole night wondering what this debt collector would demand from her family. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the bucket of chicken feed. "Please, Mr. Reed," she began, her voice shaking. "If you could just give us a little more time, I promise we will find a way to pay what we owe." Thomas held up his hand gently, stopping her words. He climbed down from his horse slowly, his movements careful and respectful. "Miss Wilson, I have something to say. Something that might sound crazy." Emma stopped what she was doing and listened. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She expected him to tell her that she had 1 week to pay or lose everything. She expected harsh words and cold demands. "I have a proposal for you," Thomas said, taking off his worn hat and holding it in his hands. His dark hair was messy from the wind, and his face looked serious but kind. "Marry me." Emma's mouth fell open in complete shock. The bucket of chicken feed slipped from her fingers and scattered corn all over the ground. The chickens rushed to eat the spilled grain. But Emma did not notice. She stared at Thomas as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. "What did you say?" she whispered. Sure, she had heard him wrong. "Not for love," Thomas said quickly, his face turning red like a sunset. He looked embarrassed but determined. "For business. If we marry, I can pay your father's debts. The farm would be safe. You would never have to worry about money again." Emma stared at him like he had lost his mind completely. Her thoughts spun like leaves in a whirlwind. This stranger, this debt collector, wanted to marry her. It made no sense at all. Double quotes. "I don't even know you," she said, her voice filled with confusion and disbelief. "Why would you do such a thing? What could you possibly gain from helping us?" Thomas looked down at his dusty boots, suddenly shy. He had practiced these words all night, but now they felt heavy in his mouth. "I've been alone my whole life. Miss Wilson, I grew up in an orphanage and never had a real family. I have money, but no one to spend it on. You have a family, but no money. Maybe we can help each other." His words were simple, but Emma could hear the loneliness in his voice. It was the sound of someone who had spent years with no one to care about and no one to care about him. Emma's father, William, had been sitting quietly in his wheelchair on the front porch, listening to every word. Now he rolled his wheelchair closer to hear better. His face was thin from illness, but his eyes were still sharp and wise. "Emma," her father called softly. "Come here, child." Emma walked to her father on shaking legs. Her mind was spinning with confusion and hope and fear all mixed together. She knelt beside his wheelchair so he could speak quietly to her. "This man wants to save our farm," William whispered. His voice weak but certain. "He doesn't have to do this. He could just take the farm for the bank and move on to the next job. That tells me something important about his heart." Emma looked back at Thomas, who was standing patiently by his horse. He was not tapping his foot or looking at his pocket watch. He was not demanding an answer or making threats. He was just waiting, like a man who understood that big decisions take time. The morning sun made shadows across the farmyard, and Emma could smell the fresh hay in the barn. This place was her whole world. Every tree, every fence post, every stone held memories of her childhood and her father's love. "I need time to think," Emma said finally, her voice barely louder than the wind through the cornfields. "Of course," Thomas replied, putting his hat back on his head. "I'll be in town for 3 days. That should give you enough time to decide. There's no pressure. Miss Wilson, if you say no, I'll find another way to help your family." As Thomas climbed back onto his horse and rode away, Emma felt her world spinning like a top. A stranger wanted to marry her to save her family. It was the most generous and terrifying thing anyone had ever offered her. That evening, Emma sat by her father's bed as he rested. The lamp cast a warm glow round the small room filled with her mother's quilts and her father's. Books Emma held his thin hand and cried quietly. "I'm only 22 years old. Papa," she whispered, "I feel like the weight of the world is on my shoulders. How can I make such a big decision?" William squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. "Sometimes, child, the biggest blessings come disguised as the scariest choices." 3 days later, Emma walked slowly down the dusty main street of town toward the small inn where Thomas was staying. She had spent those 3 days thinking, praying, and talking with her father. Her decision felt both terrifying and right. At the same time, she wore her mother's old blue dress, the one she had saved for special occasions. It was faded but still beautiful, with tiny buttons down the front and lace at the sleeves. Emma had picked wildflowers from the field behind their house and braided them into her long brown hair. If she was going to change her life forever, she wanted to look her best. Thomas was sitting on the front porch of the inn, watching the road as if he had been waiting for her. When he saw her walking toward him, he stood up quickly, his chair scraping against the wooden boards of the porch. "I'll marry you," Emma said simply, without any greeting or small talk. Her voice was steady, but Thomas could see her hands shaking slightly. Thomas stood up from his chair, and hope filled his dark eyes like sunrise after a long night. "Name your conditions." "Miss Wilson." Emma took a deep breath. She had practiced these words many times. "This is business. Like you said, we sleep in separate rooms. We're partners, not husband and wife in the real way. And if either of us wants to leave, we can." Thomas nodded seriously. "I agree to everything. I just want to help your family. Miss Wilson." Nothing more, nothing less. They were married the next week in the small white church in town. The church was simple but pretty, with wooden pews and colored glass windows that made rainbow patterns on the floor when the sun shone through them. Emma's father was there in his wheelchair, smiling for the first time in months. His face looked tired, but his eyes were bright with happiness for his daughter. The preacher, Reverend James, was a kind old man with white hair and gentle hands. He performed the ceremony with just a few neighbors watching. Mrs. Patterson from the general store was there, along with Dr. Harris and his wife. They were the only people in town who knew the real reason for this unusual marriage. Emma wore the same blue dress and wildflowers in her hair. Thomas wore his best suit, which was simple but clean. When they said their vows, Emma's voice was quiet but clear. Thomas spoke his promises with respect and sincerity. Neither of them mentioned love, but both felt the weight of what they were doing. After the wedding, Thomas moved into the farmhouse. Emma gave him the small room upstairs that had been used for storage. She kept her room downstairs near her father, where she could hear him if he needed help during the night. At first, everything felt strange and awkward. Thomas was quiet and polite, like a guest who might leave at any moment. He woke up early every morning and ate breakfast quickly, then spent the whole day working on the farm. He fixed things that had been broken for years. He repaired the fence with new wood, painted the barn, and mended the roof that leaked when it rained. Emma cooked 3 meals a day and took care of her father, just as she had always done. But now she found herself stealing glances at her new husband when she thought he wasn't looking. She noticed how carefully he worked, how he never complained about the hard jobs, and how he always cleaned up after himself. Slowly, as the days passed, they began to talk. At first, their conversations were about simple things like what to plant in the garden or which animals needed medicine. But gradually, they shared more personal stories. Thomas told Emma about growing up without parents, moving from one foster home to another like a piece of furniture that nobody really wanted. He spoke about lonely Christmases and birthdays that nobody remembered. Emma listened with tears in her eyes, understanding for the first time how much courage it had taken for him to offer this marriage. Emma shared her dreams of becoming a teacher before her father got sick. She had loved school and books, and she had planned to go to the teachers' college in the big city. But when her father became ill, she had given up everything to take care of him and the farm. "You're still young," Thomas said one evening they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "When your father gets better, you could still go to school." Emma smiled sadly, shaking her head. "That dream died a long time ago, Thomas. I'm too old now, and we need the farm to survive. Dreams don't die," Thomas replied gently. "Sometimes they just wait for the right time." As the weeks passed, Emma noticed small things about Thomas that touched her heart. He was gentle with her father, helping him in and out of his wheelchair without being asked. He brought her father books from town and sat with him in the evenings, listening to stories about the farm's history. He fixed the squeaky wheel on the wheelchair and built a ramp so William could get onto the porch more easily. Thomas brought wildflowers to the dinner table every few days, picking them from the fields as he worked. He never said they were for Emma, but she knew they were. He left them in a jar by her plate, and she always thanked him quietly. One night, during a terrible storm with thunder and lightning, Emma woke up to check on the animals. She found Thomas in the barn, sitting beside a sick calf. His shirt was soaked with rain, and he looked exhausted. But he stayed with the little animal all night. "You don't have to do this," Emma said, bringing him hot coffee and a dry shirt. "Yes, I do," Thomas replied, looking at her with serious eyes. "This is my family now." Emma felt something warm spread through her chest like honey, for the first time since their marriage. She wondered if maybe this business arrangement could become something real. Spring came to the Wilson farm like a gentle promise after a long, hard winter. The trees burst into green leaves, and wildflowers bloomed in the meadows. Emma's father seemed stronger with the warmer weather, spending more time outside in his wheelchair, watching the work being done around the farm. The farm was doing better than it had in years. Thomas had used his savings not just to pay the debts, but to buy new equipment and repair everything that was broken. He had purchased a new plow, fixed the water pump, and built a stronger fence round the vegetable garden. The fields were green and healthy, promising a good harvest in the fall. Emma and Thomas worked side by side every day now. They planted new crops together, repaired the chicken coop, and tended the animals. They took more than they had in the beginning. Sharing stories from their past and quiet laughter over simple things, Emma learned that Thomas could whistle like a bird and that he knew funny stories from his travels. Thomas discovered that Emma could sing beautifully while she worked and that she knew the name of every star in the sky. Sometimes their hands would touch when they worked together, reaching for the same tool or passing a bucket of water between them. When this happened, Emma would feel her heart skip like a stone across a lake. She began to look forward to these moments, even though they made her feel confused and shy. One warm evening in late spring, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas turned to Emma with a serious expression on his face. "I need to tell you something," he said softly, his voice nervous but determined. "This marriage started as business, but it's become something else for me. I think I'm falling in love with you." Emma's breath caught in her throat like a bird trapped in a cage. She had been feeling the same thing for weeks, but was afraid to say it out loud. She was afraid that speaking about love might break the peaceful life they had built together. "Thomas, she began, her heart beating fast and her cheeks turning pink. But before she could finish her sentence, her father's voice interrupted them from inside the house. "Emma, come quickly." They both jumped up from their chairs and rushed inside to find William struggling to breathe. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he gripped the arms of his wheelchair. Emma knelt beside him and held his hand, while Thomas ran to get his horse. "I'm going to town to get Dr. Harris," Thomas called over his shoulder as he rode away into the gathering darkness. Dr. Harris was a kind man with grey hair and gentle hands. He had been the town doctor for 30 years and had delivered Emma when she was born. He arrived quickly, carrying his black medical bag, but after examining William carefully, his face was grey and sad. "I'm sorry," the doctor said quietly, taking Emma's hands in his. "His heart is very weak. It could be days, or it could be hours. There's nothing more I can do except make him comfortable." Emma felt her world crashing down round her like a house made of cards. Thomas put his strong arm round her shoulders, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. She leaned against him and let him support her weight. For 3 days and 3 nights, Emma never left her father's side. She held his hand, read to him from his favorite books, and sang the lullabies he had sung to her when she was small. Thomas brought her food and made sure she ate a little, even when she said she wasn't hungry. He made tea and kept the fire burning in the fireplace. On the 3rd night, just as the moon was rising full and bright over the farm, William opened his eyes and looked at his daughter with love and peace. "Emma, my sweet girl," he whispered, his voice soft as feathers, "I'm not afraid to go. Your mother is waiting for me, and I've missed her so much." Emma cried quietly, holding his thin hand and trying to memorize the feel of it in hers. "Thomas is a good man," William continued, his eyes moving to look at Thomas, who stood quietly in the doorway. "He loves you, and you love him. I can see it in your eyes when you look at each other. Don't be afraid to be happy, child. You deserve all the love in the world." William Wilson passed away peacefully in his sleep that night, with Emma and Thomas sitting beside his bed. The room was quiet except for the sound of the wind in the trees outside and Emma's soft crying. The funeral was held 3 days later in the same small church where Emma and Thomas had been married. The whole town came to pay their respects to William Wilson, who had been known as a kind and honest man. Thomas stood next to Emma, strong and steady as a mountain. As she said goodbye to the man who had raised her alone since her mother died, that night, Emma and Thomas sat on the front porch where William had spent so many happy hours watching the farm and the changing seasons. Emma cried for her father, and Thomas held her gently, letting her tears soak his shirt. "I do love you," Emma whispered through her tears, finally saying the words that had been in her heart for weeks. "I was just scared to admit." Thomas kissed her forehead softly, tasting the salt of her tears. "I love you too, Emma, and I promise I'll take care of you for the rest of my life, just like your father would have wanted." 1 year later, Emma and Thomas stood in the same place where they had first met, near the front porch of the farmhouse, but everything was different now. The farm looked like a completely new place, transformed by love and hard work. The broken fences were fixed with strong new wood that gleamed white in the afternoon sun. The old barn had been painted bright red with white trim, and it looked proud and beautiful against the blue sky. Flowers grew everywhere in the garden that Emma had planted with her own hands. There were roses climbing up the porch posts, sunflowers tall as a man along the fence, and daisies scattered like stars across the front yard. Thomas was no longer a debt collector riding from town to town, taking things away from families who could not pay. He had quit that job 6 months ago and become a full-time farmer. He loved working the land, watching things grow, and building something good instead of taking things away. His hands were rough now from farm work, but his heart was softer than it had ever been. Emma had started teaching the children in town, fulfilling the dream she thought she had lost forever. Every morning, she walked to the small schoolhouse where 12 children waited for her with eager faces. She taught them to read and write and count. But most importantly, she taught them to dream big dreams and never give up hope. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked, leaning against Thomas as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. "Giving up your old life for this?" Thomas smiled and pulled her closer to his side. His arm was strong round her shoulders, and she felt safe and loved. "Emma, before I met you, I wasn't really living. I was just existing, moving from place to place with no real purpose. You gave me a home, a purpose, and a love I never thought I deserved." Emma looked down at her hands, where 2 wedding rings now sat on her finger. One was the simple gold band they had exchanged in their business arrangement a year ago. The other was newer and more beautiful, with a small diamond that caught the light like a captured star. 6 months ago, they had married again, this time for love, in the same little church where their journey had begun. The second wedding had been different from the first. Emma had worn a beautiful white dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew. Thomas had worn a new suit and had flowers in his buttonhole. This time, when they said their vows, their voices were full of real love and joy. This time, when they kissed, it was not awkward or uncertain. It was the kiss of 2 people who had found their way home to each other. "I have something to tell you," Emma said, her voice full of excitement and nervousness that made her words shake slightly. Thomas turned to look at her with curious dark eyes. He could see something special in her face, a glow that made her more beautiful than ever. Emma took his rough, work-worn hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Thomas." Thomas's eyes filled with tears of pure joy. He had never imagined he could be this happy. All his life, he had been alone, unwanted, moving from place to place with no one to love and no one to love him. Now, he had a wife who adored him and a baby coming who would call him Papa. He kissed Emma softly, tasting the salt of happy tears on her lips. Then he knelt down on one knee and spoke to the tiny life growing inside her. "Hello, little one," he whispered, his voice gentle as a summer breeze. "Your mama and papa love you already, more than all the stars in the sky," as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Emma and Thomas made plans for their future. They would raise their children on this farm, teaching them about hard work, kindness, and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. They would tell them the story of how their parents met, how love grew from the most unlikely beginning. They planned to build a bigger house someday, with rooms for all the children they hoped to have. They would plant more gardens and raise more animals. Emma would continue teaching, and Thomas would work the land that now belonged to them completely. What had started as a desperate arrangement between strangers had become the greatest love story either of them could have imagined. Thomas had come to collect a debt and ended up finding a family. Emma had faced losing everything and instead gained more than she ever dreamed possible. Their love had grown slowly from small acts of kindness. It had been tested by the hardship of losing Emma's father, but it had emerged stronger than ever, like a tree that grows deep roots in rocky soil. Their love was strong because it had overcome difficulties together. As they walked hand in hand back to their home, Emma thought about her father's last words to her. He had told her not to be afraid to be happy, and he had been right. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to embrace all the joy and love that life had to offer. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, when everything seems lost and hopeless, that's exactly when something wonderful is about to begin. Love can grow anywhere, even in the hardest ground, if two hearts are willing to tend it with patience and care. The end.